Genesis 25, let's look at this together. We're turning from Abraham, and do you remember the big promises Abraham had? People, place, protection, plan. And now the promises pass to Isaac. I wonder what you expect to happen as this chapter opens. What does it look like to live under the blessing of God? You know, it must be going to be easier for Isaac because his dad has trailblazed the way. His dad has left family and country and people. His dad has gone somewhere strange. His dad has settled and made treaties and met with people and kings and fought battles. And now Isaac just gets to follow in dad's footsteps. Surely that will be easier. And think about it faith-wise. Abraham really kind of steps out in faith. But Isaac is following in the footsteps of his dad's faith. He's seen God keep his promises. He's seen God protect Abraham. I'm sure he was told the story of what a miracle birth he was. He knows that God is faithful. He's also seen his dad have fainting fits of faith and fail. And then he's seen him grow to live on the trajectory of faith. Surely Isaac's life is going to be different. Well, look at verse 11. There's a little phrase there. It says, God blessed his son Isaac. Here's the question. What does it mean to be blessed by God? As we move to the life of Isaac, it's tempting to think that, well, surely that means a great marriage. You know, Rebecca looked like a really godly woman, and we're told she's beautiful, and she certainly seems to have lots of character. She certainly seems like the ideal wife. And then surely there'll be the pitter-patter of lots of tiny little feet and the stench of lots of nappies. There'll be the safety and security as the family enjoy God's protection. Surely there'll be an increase in flocks and herds and security, and Isaac will just faithfully follow God. He'll avoid all of his dad's mistakes. Surely that's what a blessed life looks like. And then his family will just follow in his footsteps. Everything getting better from generation to generation to generation. What does it look like to be blessed by God? What does it look like for Isaac? What does it look like for Israel? What does it look like for us? I wonder how you answer that question. It's tempting to think that blessing is a Teflon life. You know, where nothing sticks. The troubles come and they just water off a duck's back. Life will be comfortable, life will be easy. It will mean passing on a better standard of life to your children than you began with, because surely God's blessing will mean everything is getting better. Or is God's blessing something different? And if so, what is it? I wonder how you answer that question. It matters because it will influence how we live. What we expect it will look like being one of God's people. How we react when things get harder. See, if we think blessing is everything getting easier, then when something hard hits, we will assume God has abandoned us. Or that we've done something horrifically wrong. Or that actually this faith is not worth it, let's just jack it all in. Two things we're going to see in these verses that help us with that. Here's the first. Living by faith isn't easy. That's the first thing you see here. Isaac may be blessed, but that doesn't make his life trouble-free. Look at verses 19 and 20. It's quite a promising start. He's the son of Abraham. That means all the promises come to him. And then he marries Rebecca, and that's a promising beginning. But look at verse 21. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. Those words unmask a world of pain, frustrated longing and self-doubt. They may be God's people. They may be experiencing blessing in some areas, but here's this one area that they just can't get past. They've got no children. Being the people of God doesn't make them immune to the pain of living in a fallen world. But notice Isaac's reaction. Don't skip past that. Isaac prayed, we're told. He doesn't copy his dad's example. Think of his dad in that situation when Sarah went so long without having a child. What did he do? He married Hagar and had a child with someone else. Isaac doesn't repeat his dad's mistake, at least not this time. That will come later. He prays. He takes God's promise of offspring to Abraham through Isaac and turns it to prayer. He asks God to do what God has promised he'll do. And it's easy for us to miss, but he does this for a long time. Look down at verse 26. When the twins are born, how old is Isaac? He is 60. How old is he in verse 20? He's 40. 20 years of patiently praying for God to keep his promises. Now that's a challenge, isn't it? All that pain for 20 years. All those promises waiting every month. Is it going to be fulfilled now? No. What do? I pray I don't despair. God's people are not immune from the pain of living in a broken world. Let me say, some of our church family know this very specific pain of childlessness. And it's really important that we see what this passage is telling us and put it in the bigger context of the Bible. Because it's easy to think this is a blanket promise. God says, pray and you'll have a child. That's not what this is saying. Isaac is praying very specifically for God to fulfill a specific promise. He promised Abraham that through Isaac his descendants would be named. And therefore, God's plan to bless the nations would come through Isaac's offspring. This is not a blanket prayer that any one of God's people can pray and therefore expect an end to childlessness. But neither is Rebekah's childlessness a sign of unconfessed sin, a lack of faith, or God's discipline. There's no suggestion of that here. And therefore it's not suggesting for anyone in a church family that if you prayed harder or had more faith, then God would give you a child. Childlessness is a painful reality of living in a broken world. It is not a sign of your status before God. But neither, and it's really important we get this, neither does childlessness relegate you to being an also-ran in God's kingdom. And the church must never give that impression. While we celebrate the birth of children, it must never be at the extent of making those who can't have them feel that somehow they are not as valid a part of the church or not as valid in their service of the kingdom. In fact, we're to mourn with them as they go through that agony and that pain. See, childlessness doesn't define you or your relationship with God. God calls his people to know his love in Jesus and serve in his kingdom for his glory, whether they have children or not. Let's come back to Genesis 25. But notice that Rebekah falls pregnant, but her pregnancy is not straightforward. Look at the little line we get, verse 22. The babies jostled each other within her. Now, some of you ladies will be thinking, Al, you, and it's obviously a male writer, have no idea that that's just normal. You know, they stretch and they squirm and it's hard work. You know, it's not easy carrying a baby. Why has this been drawn attention to here? Look at the text. God wants us to see something more than ordinary pregnancy struggles. I know pregnancy is not hard, not from experience of having it, but from experience of walking through it 4 times. But that word jostle here, actually, translators have done a great job trying to convey it, but as often in Hebrew, it has 4 or 5 different meanings, and we can only fit one word in. The word actually means jostle and crush and oppress. Now that's quite a range of meanings, isn't it? You know, jostle recalls the next day Boxing Day sales, doesn't it? You know, you get to Next and there's the Boxing Day sale and you're squeezed in and you're trying to get what you want off the rack. Not that I've ever been. But that's what I'm told it's like by my sister. Actually, clash and crush carries a whole together different picture. It's a picture of war. It's a picture of oppression. And Rebecca's actually at the end of her tether. Having prayed desperately to fall pregnant, she's pregnant and the pain is so great, the jostling is so great, the warring is so great in her womb that she goes to God and says, why is this happening to me? Kind of carries the idea of, is this going to be worth it? Would it be better off this just ended now? Look what God says to her. 2 nations are in your womb and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. 1 people will be stronger than the other and the elder will serve the younger. I wonder how much comfort this prophecy was to Rebekah, because basically God is saying this is just the beginning of the conflict between these 2 boys within your womb. That's what it's saying, isn't it? There'll be 2 nations And those two nations will go on and they will carry on the sibling rivalry. The struggle will continue. These two sons will battle for supremacy. We're going to see that over the next 10 chapters in Genesis. This is sibling rivalry on steroids. I don't know how you got on with your brothers and sisters. My brother and I had quite a strong rivalry. There are doors in my parents' house that attest to it. There was a car door that we had a falling out through that lost. Remember the little pop-up locks? We managed to kick one of those off, having a fight through a window. And we had quite a good sibling rivalry. But this is far greater than anything to do with that. And it will continue through the centuries as Israel and Edom, the two nations that come from these two boys, war and clash. And so it proves. You notice the birth account? There are twin boys, verse 24. The first to come out was red, his whole body like a hairy garment. They named him Esau. After this, his brother came out. What did he come out doing? Grasping his heel. Almost as if Jacob is trying to claw him back in so he can get out first. Because the firstborn in those days had what was called the birthright. If you had two children, you would divide your inheritance into three, and the eldest would get 2/3, and the second would only get 1/3. It's almost as if Jacob in the womb knows that, and he's wrestling to try and get out, grabbing his brother to pull him back in like some kind of rugby scrum. God's word comes true. His prophecy of the struggle that would come, even seen at their birth. God does bless Isaac and Rebekah. He is keeping his promises to Abraham, but that doesn't mean life is easy for them. It doesn't bring immunity from struggle. Living by faith in a broken world is hard for God's people, but God keeps his promises and he is with them. Notice that. Don't miss that. Who does Rebekah go to, verse 22? She goes to the Lord. Why? Because God is with his people. He's not set them off and then left them to it. You know, he's not like that teacher who set you off on your work and then leaves the room to have a coffee and then comes back 10 minutes later. Not that anyone ever does that, of course. You know, that's not what God is like. God is involved and with his people as he promises them. Israel often fell into the trap of believing life should be easy following God. So once rescued from Egypt, what do? They moan about the food they're miraculously provided with. Why? Because life with God should be better. It should be Miller and Carter steaks all day, every day, not this manna stuff. Faced with the promised land, they shrink back. Why? Because, well, following God should be easy. We shouldn't have to fight anyone, and they certainly shouldn't be more muscular than we are. You know, life should be easy. We see that again and again. Where are we tempted to fall into that same trap? To believe that being God's people, living under his blessing, should be easy. Now let me say, we have more to go on than Isaac did. God has kept that promise of a plan. His promise has come true. Jesus has been born in the world, experiences our pain and struggles, as well as the joy and happiness that we experience. He lives amid the brokenness. And he lives and dies to save a people, so that if we've entrusted him, if we've trusted in him, we have so many more blessings. Forgiveness, welcome, adoption. We are filled with his spirit that he pours out on his people. And we are blessed with access to the heavenly throne room. Just as Rebekah goes and prays to God, we can come and pray to God. We have the blessing of being part of a church family, and all the riches of Christ are ours. And we're blessed because Jesus knows our struggles and stands by his Father's side in heaven with arms open and a smile on his face. He welcomes us even when we fail. Jesus doesn't stand in heaven when we fail with his arms crossed and a frown on his shaking head, writ large with disappointment. When we fail and we sin and we fall, he stands with his arms open, ready to forgive and welcome and brush us off and send us out into the world once more. See, Jesus sympathizes with us. He prays for us. See, just think of those blessings. And yet so often aren't we tempted to just want the physical here now blessings, and we underplay those other blessings? Because the kingdom is now and not yet, and that means we live with attention. We are called to live as citizens of heaven, but we do so in a broken world. We have all these blessings, and yet we experience the brokenness that we know one day will be wiped away. God's people and the church are to be a beacon of light in the darkness because we live by faith. We live thanking God for his blessings and praying to him even where life is hard, just as Rebecca and Isaac do. Holding on to God's promises even in the darkness. We choose by faith to be people of light even as we experience the darkness. We look to the light even when it seems black all around. We fix our eyes on the blessing, particularly the blessing yet to come when Christ returns and his kingdom will be fulfilled. And in the meantime, we prayerfully live by faith, expressing our longing for that day as we pray. Here's the second thing we see. God is at work to transform the unpromising. It's not just on the pictures we post on social media that we use filters, is it? It's not just magazines that airbrush their pictures. We use filters and airbrushes on life all the time, just to make things look better than they are. Let me ask you a question. How was getting ready for church this morning? Was it as calm and peaceful and serene as it all appeared as you walked in through the door? Or was there quite a lot of stress? The odd crossword, a little bit of frustration, a little bit of, get out of bed and get a move on, and have you not had your breakfast, and turn that device off, and maybe that's just our house. Often the half an hour before church is the most stressful of the week. I remember someone said to me it was the most ungodly moment before we tried to be our most godly. I think there's a ring of truth in that, isn't there? Especially if you've got kids. As we rush to get ready, especially at the minute, have you got your mask? Have you got your crayons? Have I printed the sheets out? Have I got my Bible? And then inevitably you get in the car and someone's forgotten something, and it's normally mum or dad. But then we drive into church and there's a miracle happening. Haven't you spotted it as people drive into the car park at church? Suddenly all of that melts away and the smiles are on, and we're all getting on, and we walk in okay. Now that's me poking a bit of fun, but actually there's an element of truth in that, isn't there? It's very rare that we've fallen out in the car on the way to church, and we carry on that fallout as you come in through the doors. I'm not advocating that you do. The rest of us would appreciate it if you don't. But we do just airbrush life a little, don't we? And we also do it more deeply. What if I asked you this morning how you're doing spiritually? What's your reflex answer? Some of you will have thought it straight away. I'm fine. What's the reality? What about if I ask you about life in general, or work, or school, or home? What about if I ask you how you're doing with coronavirus and the restrictions and possibly 6 months of this and how that makes you feel? Would the reflex reaction be fine, or are we going to deal with reality? What about if I ask you how you're doing with church? How you feel about it? What's the reflex? What's the reality? How about if we got more detailed? What if I said to you, and you couldn't get away and you had to answer me, what if I said, are you enjoying reading your Bible? How are you finding prayer? How are you finding loving people in church? Or are they just annoying people you keep away from because you know they'll just get your goat? How was standing up for the gospel at work or at home or in the neighbourhood? What is the reflex? It's to say, it's fine. But what is reality? Now, Genesis 25, we get an X-ray picture into the life of this family. It's a bit like an episode of Super Nanny, where she goes in and you can see all this squabbling and mum and dad aren't doing discipline properly, or one's doing one thing and one's doing another, or family swap. They all kind of thrive off that idea of conflict, don't they? And you feel better because someone else's family is more dysfunctional than your own. It's programs where family's dirty laundry is aired in public. Well, there's an element of that as we come to Genesis 25. They are a deeply flawed family, aren't they? Can you find a hero in verses 27 to 34? Because I really can't. Don't feel too smug. I have a hunch if someone sat back and wrote our family story, knowing every gory detail, it probably wouldn't be that different. And it's sad because Isaac and Rebecca seem so godly in their approach in the first part of the story. And then the boys grow up, at verse 27 and 28, and they're very, very different. Do you notice that? Esau's a kind of outdoorsman. He loves hunting and, skinning animals and all the stuff that comes with that, the blood and the guts and what some people would call the manly stuff. Jacob is much quieter. He's a homeboy. He loves being around the tents. He's not outdoorsy. let me just say, it's a helpful reminder, isn't it, that the Bible doesn't deal in stereotypes. The Bible doesn't tell us there is one type of man and one type of woman. It doesn't say masculinity looks like Esau. It doesn't say femininity looks like one particular type. Not all men love hunting. You don't have to be outdoorsy to be a real man in the Bible. Just as we meet godly women in the Bible who excel and thrive at leading business and at leading and then being in battle. If God doesn't do stereotypes, let me say, neither must we as God's people. I think that's a challenge in the world we live in. To just recognize that people are different and God has wired them that way. But look at verse 28. Here we begin to see the problem. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob's. And that sowed the seeds of so much of what's to come in the following chapters. Favoritism has a toxic effect on this family. And maybe you can think of places you've seen that play out. You know, we have a running joke in our family that I have a favourite and I just say, no, I don't like any of you. You know, actually, because there's a danger, isn't there, in thinking one is a favourite. Now, the scene shifts, and we've been told that detail for a reason that will become clear in a couple of chapters' time. But the scene shifts, and Esau's been out hunting, and you know, considering he was a hunter, he's not had a great day because he comes back with nothing, and he's starving, hungry. He says, quick, let me have some of that red stew, I'm famished. Now, here's the question. What should a brother do in that situation? It's not difficult to work out, is it? You've got a bowl of stew, you clearly can't eat all of it. Your brother comes in starving, hungry. What should Jacob do? Here's a bowl. Help yourself. But Jacob is plotting and scheming. He wants the birthright. I can't help wondering if he's deliberately set himself up there so that as Esau comes in, he's going to smell it, he's going to be hungry, and he's ready to pounce. Jacob is that conniving. We'll see that later with stuff he does. He wants that birthright. He wants that 2/3 of the inheritance. And Esau, driven by hunger, verses 31 to 34, despises his birthright. He trades all the privileges and promises for a bowl of lentil soup. It's not even steak. I mean, it's lentils. Seriously? Who gives up anything for lentils? Now, Israel would have reacted with utter shock. We just think, that was a silly deal. Except actually, when you think biblically, Esau is trading all of the promises God has made to Abraham that have passed to Isaac and would pass on with the birthright. He's trading promises of place, protection, people, and a part in God's plan. He treats it with utter contempt. If you want a modern equivalent, there's nothing quite like it, but I guess it's a bit like showing contempt of court. You take something that comes with serious responsibilities and privileges and you treat it like nothing. And therefore you get found in contempt of court. That's what Esau does. He says, I don't want my birthright. It's not worth having. I'd rather have a bowl of lentil soup. You can take all of God's promises, people, place, plan, protection, all the things he's done for granddad and for dad. I'd rather just have this bowl of lentil soup. And you have to say, this little snapshot of this family, the family of promise is not a promising family, is it? Riven with favoritism, conniving, and then contempt for what matters. There are no heroes. There are no positive role models. And yet, amazingly, this is the family God has chosen to bless. Doesn't part of you think, God, there must be a better family somewhere? Seriously, they can't be the best there is to offer. They don't deserve this. They don't merit involvement in your plan. But that's the point. See, neither do Israel, neither do we, and the point is that God is a God of grace. God will work in and through Rebekah, Isaac, even Esau and Jacob. God will transform Jacob by his grace over the coming chapters from a man who connives and deceives into a man who lives by faith. It takes a long time. But Jacob is not yet the man God will transform him to be. God will save him by grace and he will refit him and redeem him to fulfill his purposes. It ought to shock us that God can use people like Jacob, like Esau, like Rebekah. Just as it ought to shock us that God can use people like us. Read 1 Corinthians 1 verses 26 to 31 when you get home. Paul reminds the Corinthians that God has chosen the foolish and the weak and he transforms them by his grace, by the Spirit. This is a theme of God throughout. He uses the foolish and the weak. That's true of Jacob, it's true of Israel, it's true of the disciples, it's true of you, and it's true of me. We don't deserve salvation. There's nothing we do that can earn it. But that means actually you don't need to do anything to earn it. You just come and accept the gift. God saves by grace and then sets about transforming us. It reminds us God can save anyone. But let me say, it also calls us to be patient with both ourselves and with others. That once saved, God will transform. But do you know what? It takes a long time for Jacob. Jacob is going to learn who God is. He's going to be called to live by faith. He's going to play his part in God's promises and purposes. Not because he deserves it, but because God is gracious. And God will. He will delight in saving and transforming him. And that's true of us. And that means we need to be patient with one another. Not expect perfection as a download. It also means we ought to be humble and grateful. The good news is God is not finished with us yet. That means there's no room for despair. Do you ever feel a failure as a Christian? You know, I've done it again, or not done it again. Or I've said that again. I've reacted that same way, and I thought I was dealing with that. And we're going to see Jacob has an ongoing problem with deceiving people. A repeated pattern of sin. But God perseveres. God saves by grace, and God transforms him. God does not save the sorted. God sorts and sanctifies the saved. Not all at once, but over a lifetime. The call is to cooperate with God as he does that. That's the blessing of being God's people. He saves us, he secures our future, he invites us into his kingdom. He calls and fits us by his Spirit to serve his purpose. And he is at work transforming us so we cooperate in his mission. But there's one last thing to see here. It's a warning. It's really rare in Genesis for the narrator to interject, to tell us something apart from just the story. He does just that in the last phrase of the chapter. He tells us, so Esau despised his birthright. God and the author want us to get that, to not miss what's just happened. Esau treats God's promises with utter contempt. And he stands as a warning to us. The pastor who writes Hebrews in chapter 12 and verse 16 uses Esau as a warning. Not to do the same, not to give up the promises of God, not to trade them for something that doesn't last, not to give up eternal treasure for temporary comfort. Can you see the danger of doing that, the temptation to do that? And he says, don't trade all the treasures of the promises of God, the blessings that are yours as Christ redeemed people, for something temporary now. What does it mean to be blessed by God, to be his people? God doesn't promise us immunity from brokenness. He does promise us his presence as we walk through the brokenness. And he promises his promises will come true, that he is faithful. And by grace calls us and fits us to be his people, to live by faith cooperating with him as he transforms us, as we await his promises come true.